Don't get me wrong, I love Viltrox's Lab Series and Pro Series lenses, but in many ways, it is their Air Series that is perhaps the most intriguing for a lot of people. They're small, they're light, and maybe most importantly, they're very affordable despite being very high performing optically. Yes, these are very simple lenses, but they make up for that by having a tough build, good autofocus, and very, very good optics. Now, to this point, most of the lenses in the series have fallen into the fairly conventional 35 to 85 millimeter range, or the APS-C equivalents. But now that they have covered those more conventional focal lengths pretty well, they are finally starting to venture outside of that paradigm. And today's release of both a full frame and an APS-C truly wide-angle lens is very, very interesting. Now, I'm going to start with the full frame. That is my preferred platform, and so I'm going to look at the 14mm f4 first and follow that up in a week with the 9mm f2.8. These lenses are identical in size and appearance. However, one is designed for full frame and the other, the 9mm, is designed for APS-C. And so you take that 9mm, multiply it by the 1.5 times crop factor of the various camera systems, and you end up with a 13.5mm lens, or essentially that 14mm lens. Now, the APS-C lens is a little bit wider than the 14mm. However, this is an extremely wide focal length in such a compact form like I've never seen before. And yes, the maximum aperture is only f4. But don't let that put you off, because this lens is intensely sharp even from f4 on. It's a really impressive accomplishment to have such high performance and such a wide angle of view in such a compact form factor. And being able to get all of that for under $200 US is really pretty intriguing, and that is what makes the Viltrox Air Series work. We're going to dive into the whole performance of the 14mm f4 lens today and detail whether or not this is a lens that should get onto your short list if you're wanting a wide-angle prime that you can take anywhere. Let's dive in, let's take a look. So all of the outdoor segments that you'll see in this video have been filmed on my Sony a7R Mark V using the 14mm f4, shooting wide open at f4. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Viltrox for evaluation. As always, they have had no input in this review or my findings, and they will not see this video before you do. This is a completely independent review. So this lens will be available in both Sony FE, which I'm reviewing here, but then also on Nikon Z mount. At this point, hopefully future platforms, Canon RF would be fantastic in the future. As you can see, this lens is identical in size, same dimensions to the 9mm f2.8. And in many ways, it's kind of a unique approach here, engineering lenses and probably sharing some of that engineering process. And so you produce both a full frame and then an APS-C equivalent outcome. Now, as you can see, the APS-C lens at 9mm is a little bit wider than what the 14mm is in terms of the angle of view. That's to be expected because that does come out to about 13.5mm, but also at 112-degree angle of view for the 14mm. That is a little bit narrower than some other 14mm lenses that I've reviewed in the past. And so it is wide, but not quite as wide as what some of those lenses are. The dimensions of the lens are 65mm in diameter, or 2.55 inches, by 56.4 millimeters in length, or 2.22 inches. This makes that a fantastic pairing if you happen to own one of the A7C series of cameras. This is a beautiful wide-angle option for that, allowing you to travel really small and light, particularly if you got the A7 or A7CR, to be able to compare that, that 61 megapixel sensor with this lens in such a compact package. Pretty fantastic. It takes 58mm filter threads up front. That is shared with the 9mm and a lot of other lenses as well, including a number of other from the Air series. The weight here is 170 grams, or 6 ounces. Now, in Nikon Z mount, because of that wider diameter mount, that weight goes up to 185 grams, still extremely lightweight. Interestingly, the APS-C lens is 5 grams heavier than what the 14mm is. That's not enough to actually really feel the difference. I can't discern it with, just in terms of holding it, but it is just ever so slightly heavier. This does, as all Viltrox lenses, has the USB-C port for doing quick and easy firmware updates on the mount, but really that's about it for any kind of features. There is no weather sealing outside of an anti-fouling coat that's resistant to fingerprints and water on that front element, but there is no gasket here at the lens mount, which is true for all of the Air Series lenses. Neither are there any switches or buttons on it. We just have a focus ring here. Fortunately, the focus ring is nicely damped. You can focus with precision, and the autofocus motor is reactive enough that you're able to focus without any kind of lag there as well. It does come with the included lens hood and then also a pouch. The lens hood does bayonet on with nice precision and will lock into place. I didn't have any issues with the lens hood moving around, but it stayed in place once it was mounted. Inside, we do have 7 aperture blades. I like that better than the 9 blades that they put on some lenses. For a wide-angle lens, I prefer a lower blade count. And in this case, that allows you to get 14-bladed sun stars that look pretty decent, really, all things considered. Not the best that I've seen, but certainly nice enough to add to images in the right kind of situation. Now, interestingly, this lens does better than a lot of Viltrox lenses in terms of minimum focus distance. You can focus as closely as 13 centimeters, which means that you can get very close to your subject. That ends up being only about 3.5 centimeters beyond the lens hood, which means you might want to remove the lens hood sometimes so you don't shade your subject, but you can get a 0.23 times level of magnification. That's nice and high and allows you to get some creative shots and to use that to good effect. And so overall, as with all of the Air Series lenses, the lens feels tough, but it's simple. There's nothing going on here in terms of bells and whistles. This is really all about the optics and the autofocus performance inside. So let's move on to those things. So let's talk autofocus. As always in the Air Series, they are using a lead screw type STM focus motor or stepping motor. In this case, with a wide angle of view and then also a relatively small maximum aperture, focus doesn't have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting here. So there isn't typically a big difference between focus changes unless you're going all the way from the closest focus towards infinity. So most of the time, focus adjustments are very small, which means that in my formal test, autofocus is pretty much instantaneous. There's really hardly any perceptible change between focusing on a closer subject, in this case about 1 meter away, to a subject that is about 5 or 6 meters away. And then if I go outside and the background is even further away, it really doesn't make any difference. Focus is basically instantaneous. The only time I saw focus slow down really is when I tried to test this in very low light conditions, because obviously that is the biggest challenge for a lens like this. A maximum aperture of f4 and the inability to open up any wider means that that is the maximum amount of light that the camera can use for focus. And so in very dim conditions, it just doesn't have as much light to work with as a lens with an f2.8 or brighter aperture. And so what I found is that while focus did slow down and maybe took a little bit before it locked, it always locked accurately, even in extremely dim conditions. So I don't really have any kind of reservation. That's kind of par for the course. You can't defeat physics in this instance, but the fact that the focus motor still got the job done was impressive. Focus, because of those little changes, this is going to work fine for sports and things like that, because frankly there's enough speed there, and also the lens the focus system doesn't have to be incredibly reactive because it's not having to make major focus changes, and depth of field is always going to be pretty big. However, I found even in this situation where I was trying to lock onto blowing grass, and you can see here in the video how wildly it is blowing, but I was able to lock on and snap this photo. And so I think autofocus is reactive enough to keep up even when you're at close focus distances where there actually is focus variances. It was keeping up in all of that. And so really at the end of the day, autofocus works great for all the applications that I use the lens for. So let's talk video AF. Once again, in this situation, as with conventional autofocus, focus doesn't have to work particularly hard. And so actually when I was doing my focus pull test, as you can see here, on camera, I wasn't even sure that focus was actually changing because it took viewing it on a larger monitor to actually see that focus variation. I could see when I did that there is a little bit of focus breathing, but the focal length and maximum aperture being both wide on the former and small on the latter meant that while there is a little bit of focus breathing, it's hardly detectable, and so it's not really going to be a significant issue in any kind of situation. My hand test, likewise, the adjustment between going from my hand to my face and back forth, it was so subtle that you really couldn't pick up on it much. But you know, when I tried to look critically, at the appropriate times, either my hand or my face was in focus. And so focus didn't have to change much to achieve that. Really, I can't ask for it to do something that's unnecessary. And so in those situations, I felt that autofocus was fine. Now, more importantly, for a lens like this is going to be an excellent vlogging type lens. So let's take a look how it performs in that kind of setting. So vlogging is a pretty obvious application for a focal length like this. And as you can see, this is a lens that's going to have no problem keeping focus on your face. And it is a great focal length for this kind of work. Nice and wide, but not so wide that it's distorting your features and making you look weird. And so I think that vlogging is going to be a great application, and probably gimbal work in general, the lens being so lightweight. This is a great video lens. So obviously works well for the vlogging type scenario, and even when I used it in more of an action situation, footage, as you can see, it looks good, and also, you know, focus wasn't hunting or moving around. So this is going to be a really excellent lens, not only for vlogging, but just gimbal work in general. The fact that you can get this lens and it is so compact in length and it weighs only 170 grams means that it can fit onto, you know, maybe allow you to use smaller and cheaper motorized gimbals, but either way, it's going to not obstruct the gimbal, and so, you know, you can do the full inception mode, rotations, and things like that you might not be able to do with a bigger, heavier lens. So I think it's going to have a lot of interesting applications for that, and that's certainly an application that I might consider using it for in the future, to get that wonderfully wide angle of view, but then also to get a nice stable platform where a lot is going to be in focus. Should be pretty sweet. So video AF, no problems on that front either. And we've got an optical design of 12 elements in 9 groups, and the majority of those are exotic elements, including 4 extra low dispersion elements, 2 high refractive index elements, and 2 aspherical elements. You can see from the MTF that it's really solid, very sharp in the center over that 90% threshold, and there is a steady decline off towards the corners. But one of the things that stands out is that both the sagittal and meridial lines, they stay very close together as it goes, which means you have low astigmatism and your contrast is going to look better. And that's something that really stands out to me. Optically, this lens reminds me probably most of the Sigma 17mm f4, a similar lens that's compact and has a small maximum aperture, but it's intensely sharp and high contrast right from that maximum aperture. And that's true here. In fact, this lens across most of the frame is actually sharper at f4 than what it is at f8. It's designed to deliver peak performance right from the beginning. And the only thing really that's going to improve, which bore out in my test at f8, is that the corners may look a hair sharper stopped down to f8. Bottom line is that this lens is extremely sharp and high contrast even on a 61 megapixel sensor, which is the highest currently available on full frame platforms. So that's fantastic for such a small and inexpensive lens, particularly when you're talking wide angle, which is so incredibly complex to engineer. So I'm not quite sure how they pulled it off. What I found when it comes to some of the other factors, distortion, for example, is very low. There's not a lot of native distortion, but it is a bit complex. So if I corrected for the barrel distortion in the center of the frame, that's about a +7 dialing that in. I create some pin cushion distortion on the edges. So manual correction doesn't work fantastic. Using the correction profile when it becomes available is going to be a better option. But again, to give you a little bit of perspective, a +7 to correct this lens, the recent Schneider LK Samyang lens that I reviewed at 14 millimeters, the 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8. At 14 millimeters, it required a +29 to correct. And then lenses like the Sony 16 millimeter f1.8, for example, they require that and more to correct for. And so this is actually a really low distortion figure. And what it means is that even uncorrected, this lens actually works for quite a lot of subjects. I found when shooting architecture, for example, as you can see in this shot of my son's university, everything looks good. Likewise, when I shot of this bridge, instead of it getting warped at some place by distortion, it looks nice and straight all the way across. And so really quite impressive in terms of those metrics. Vignette is a +48, so that's less than 2 stops. And again, not bad at all for a wide angle lens, and certainly not for one this small. It's not unusual for me to see twice as much vignette as that on many other type lenses. And so really, really good. And that's one area where it definitely is better than that Sigma 17mm f4. I saw no longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, very clean before and after the plane of focus. I saw minimal lateral style chromatic aberrations in the corners of the frame, so no real problem there. When looking at resolution, here is a look at the chart that I use for that, and I'm going to show you 61 megapixel crops at 200% magnification. So even at that very high level of scrutiny, the center looks fantastic, mid-frame looks fantastic, and really the corners look very good until maybe the last percentage 2 points. It looks really, really fantastic. And to give you again a quick comparison, that Schneider Samyang lens in the center of the frame, I would say that the Viltrox, both of them at f4, Viltrox is probably a hair sharper and higher contrast. And in the corners, they're close. I would maybe give a tiny edge to the Schneider lens, but they are just incredibly close there. And so, I mean, it's a great optical performance for this kind of price point. So you'll find that you don't get really any further center improvement when you stop down, but you will see just a little bit more even profile to where the corners get a little bit sharper while the center remains really fantastically sharp. So if you shoot at landscape apertures of f5.6, f6.3, f8, you'll find that it just looks great. And so I'm really, really impressed with the images you can get from this lens. It's a great landscape lens, great contrast, great detail, and great color. It's very, very impressive on that. As is usual, you will see diffraction show up at about f11 because that has to do with the resolution of the camera, not so much the performance of the lens, but it's not bad in this case. Of course, I'm looking at 200% magnification. Even at f16, probably if you're just looking at 100% magnification, you'd still be happy with the end results, and so don't hesitate to shoot there. In this situation, this is not a lens designed to produce bokeh, but because it can focus so closely, you can blur out backgrounds somewhat. And the quality of that blur is really not too bad. There's a little bit of outlining, but not bad. I actually prefer the bokeh from the 14mm full frame than what I did from the 9mm APS-C lens, despite that lens having a larger maximum aperture. And it's really more about the nature of the rendering of the background blur, which I favor a little bit more on the 14mm. Don't buy it for that, obviously, but the fact that it can produce reasonably compelling images for that up close is really nice. For example, I could shoot this big picture shot of wildflowers that were growing beyond this little pond, and then I could move in close and get more of a detail shot of one of the wildflowers. And that's kind of cool, just to be able to do that storytelling like that. Flare performance in most situations was also quite good as well. And as you can see here as I pan back and forth, that contrast holds up really, really well. That's never a problem. And there is a little bit of ghosting, but it doesn't show up much. And when you stop down, you'll see that ghosting pattern a little bit more. But I found that in most situations, flare resistance was really quite good. Obviously very important in such a wide angle lens. Bottom line is that this lens actually has quite few optical flaws, and that is really, really impressive. Again, in engineering such a small lens that covers such a wide angle of view, and at such a low price, hard to beat it. So at the end of the day, I think that this is actually one of the most interesting lenses that has come to the Air series so far. Not just because it is so optically sound, but I've never seen a 14mm lens this compact before, and the fact that it is competent even out to the corners in such a compact package is really, really intriguing to me. I can really see this a lens that I could personally use. Unfortunately, I don't get to use my own gear very much because I'm always reviewing something new. But when I travel, that's kind of the exception to the rule, and so typically I may be taking some review things along, but I'm wanting something to augment that, to get the kind of photos that I just want to get when I'm traveling. And being able to get such a wide angle of view for video and stills in such a compact package that I can easily throw into a bag is really, really interesting. And so for a price of under $200, this is a lens I think that could be the gateway for a lot of people that have maybe considered the idea of a ultra wide angle prime, but didn't want to spend the money to get to a competent lens. In this case, I think that this has brought this focal length down to a much more affordable place, accessible place for a lot of different photographers. And if you've never experienced with the very unique images you can get with something that's ultra wide, this is a great place to start exploring. At the end of the day, Viltrox's Air series continues to really impress me. And as they delve into more unique focal lengths like this, I think that the series could get more interesting still. This stays very true to the ethos of the series of being able to, carry less and capture more. That definitely applies here. And so kudos to Viltrox for designing something I think that is going to be really genuinely useful for a whole lot of people and at a price tag that they can afford. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, check out the full text review in the description down below. The DustinAbbott.net has a whole new redesign. It's now much more accessible, easier to read, and through the incredible search capabilities, you can find articles on whatever you're looking for. So check that out today. There are buying links there. And if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, as always, this is the place to be. And we're going to dive into that right now together. Let's take a look.
Okay, let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So if we look here on the left, an uncorrected image, we can see that the amount of distortion is really quite low, but we can also see that it's not consistent, that you can see it bulges out here in the center and then drops off towards the corners. So if you do your best to straighten out these internal lines, as I've done here, you'll see that you start to then cause the corners to creep out in more of a pincushion style distortion. We call this a mustache pattern. And the amount of distortion is low enough that, in many cases, as we're going to see, you don't have to worry about even correcting. However, clearly when the correction profile is available, it's going to do a cleaner job of correcting this, because I can only correct in one direction, and the correction profiles are able to actually be tailored to the lens itself. So a very mild amount of distortion. This is a +7 to correct for barrel distortion. Vignette is dialed in at +48 to eliminate the vignette in the corners. So here's a look at a real-world shot that has received zero correction. And so you can see even down here into this leading line of these steps that there is no obvious distortion. If we zoom into the various brick surfaces and lines in this image, you can see that everything is really looking it's clean. There's no obvious issues with barrel distortion. So in most situations, it really works well. This is, again, uncorrected. We can see there's no real obvious bulging anywhere of lines. So the truth of the matter is that this would be a really great budget real estate lens for someone that's looking for a nice wide angle of view, but one without a lot of distortion. Likewise, in this shot towards of a bridge, you can see that the bridge lines stay nice and clean as we move across. So again, I'm not too concerned with any of those fronts. And if we pop back here for a moment, this is also uncorrected at f4 for vignette. You can see that in this space, it probably would clean up a bit if you added in a little bit of vignette correction, but we can also see that it's in no way damaging to the image itself. So a surprisingly clean performance here for vignette and distortion. When it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, they are just basically non-existent. It's only a maximum aperture of f4, so you're not going to have a whole lot of situations like this where you have a really shallow depth of field. But even if you do, you can see that that's not a problem. Lateral style chromatic aberration, I see a little bit on the most dominant lines there, but little otherwise. I don't see any actual areas of concern for me here. So moving on to resolution and contrast, we're going to show you results at 200% magnification, and this is shot on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V. Center of the frame looks fantastic. High detail, high contrast. Moving off to mid-frame, it looks really, really great. This is fantastic. You can see very high contrast and detail. And so that means that we have a really nice consistency from here to here, for example, holding up well. And as we pan down even towards the corners, this side of the corner looks great. It tails off a little bit here, but really right off towards the edge of the frame. Detail is holding up nicely. If I compare real-world results from f4 to f8, we can see in the center of the frame, it doesn't really look radically different. There's a little bit more contrast, and so I think textures do pop a little bit more, but you'd be hard-pressed without looking at them side by side to tell a difference. As you move off towards the edge of the frame here, we can see that it's possible that you're getting a little bit more. You can just tell that there's a little bit more resolution here as you get towards the edge of the frame. But again, you can see even towards the edge, it is not radically different. What you will see, however, is depth of field increase. And so now this is more in focus than what it was at f4. Likewise, over here, you're going to see that it's holding up better into this corner. But again, that's a lot about depth of field and less about just overall resolution. This lens gives you really strong performance even at f4. Biggest improvements that I see is that at f5.6 and f8, you do start to get a little bit better performance in the corners. I noticed it here as well, that particularly if you look at this zone through here, you can see that this insignia, even at f5.6, is not quite as clear as what it is at f8. But we can also see that we've got a nice centering consistency. Overall, this is a really good optical performance. Again, just for some real world perspective, here at f5.6, this is a big scene with lots of textures. And so we can see that there is good texture information right off towards the edge of the frame, even at high levels of magnification. Likewise here, you can just see that that detail carries on into the distance. There's a lot of information on actually on frame here right now. And so it's really impressive how well that this inexpensive lens captures it all. So as per usual, you can see the effects of diffraction showing up here at f11 and a little bit more pronounced by f16, so a general kind of softening of the image. But again, just to give perspective, if we're just looking at 100% magnification, even here at f16, you can see there's a little bit more bloom on the textures, but you can also see that the detail is still very, very usable. And so in real world results, you could still shoot at f16 if you so desired. Now up close, we can see not only do we get a nice level of magnification, plane of focus is not completely flat, but in the area of focus, we can see that contrast and detail really looks quite good. And so I have no major concerns about that. And that just does give you some really interesting options. And so here, for example, this is shooting at the big scale distance. And this is what was catching my eye, is that this area has grown up with just natural wildflowers growing really strong. So I wanted to catch that reflection. And then I got a little bit closer so I could capture this, whole mound of wildflowers, but then to be able to pop in even closer at close focus distances and just tell this story in 3 different kinds of ways, which is really unique opportunity through this lens. And again, we can see that as far as the bokeh quality of this lens, you can get nice and close to the subject. These little wildflowers are tiny. And you can see that the quality of the background is not bad. It's not like it's super creamy and soft, but it actually looks reasonably good in the zone without any kind of major outlining. Likewise here, again, it's not strongly defocused, and so you can still see all the background, but you can also see it doesn't look bad either. And we got great detail here on the subject, this bumblebee jumping into that wildflower. All of that's good. Again, the sun star looks pretty decent, and as we've seen previously when we go back and forth across the sun, that the flare resistance is really quite strong. It's a lens that's impressive on a lot of levels.
So hopefully the optical deep dive has helped you to determine whether or not this is the lens that you have been looking for. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.